I've supported myself since I was 15, never took a cent from my parents, worked 2 jobs, skipped vacations, and finally bought my first house at 26. At Christmas dinner, my dad pointed at me and screamed, "You stole your sister's future." 3 weeks later, I got served. My parents were suing me for ruining her chances. What happened next was absolutely hilarious. I, 26M, was sitting in my new living room when the process server knocked on my door. The house still smelled like fresh paint and possibility, and I'd spent the previous weekend arranging furniture I'd saved 3 years to buy. The envelope he handed me felt heavier than it should have, and when I opened it, I understood why. My parents were suing me for $200,000 for emotional damages and loss of future opportunities for my sister. The Christmas dinner had been 3 weeks earlier, and I could still hear my father's voice echoing in my head. We'd been sitting around their dining table, the one I'd never been allowed to help pick out because by the time they bought it, I was already living on my own. My sister had been complaining about her apartment search, about how impossible it was to find anything decent in this market, about how unfair life was. My mother had made sympathetic noises while serving her 3rd helping of dessert. Then my father had asked about my new place, and I'd made the mistake of being honest. I told them about the 3-bedroom house with the small backyard, about the reasonable mortgage I'd secured through a first-time homebuyer program, about how proud I felt to have accomplished this entirely on my own. The silence that followed should have warned me. My father's face had turned red, that vein in his forehead pulsing the way it used to when I'd come home past curfew as a teenager. Except I hadn't lived under his roof since I was 17. He'd stood up so fast his chair fell backward, pointed directly at me, and screamed that I'd stolen my sister's future. The words had come out in a spray of spit and rage. He said I'd been selfish my entire life, that I'd abandoned the family to pursue my own greedy ambitions, that I'd deliberately gotten ahead so my sister would look bad by comparison. My mother had started crying, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin while nodding along to every accusation. My sister had sat there with this strange smile on her face, not saying anything, just watching me like I was a show she'd been waiting to see. I'd left without finishing my meal, and I hadn't spoken to any of them since. Until the lawsuit. The thing nobody seemed to understand was that I'd been supporting myself since I was 15. It started with a weekend job at a grocery store, bagging items and collecting carts from the parking lot. I needed money for basic things, clothes that fit, school supplies, gas for the beaten-up car I'd bought with my own savings. My parents had made it clear early on that my sister needed their financial support more than I did. She was younger, more delicate, had more challenges to overcome. They never specified what those challenges were, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. By 16, I'd added a second job washing dishes at a restaurant 3 nights a week. I'd finish school, head straight to one job, then rush to the other, getting home after midnight most days. My grades had suffered a bit, but I kept them respectable enough. College was never really discussed as an option for me. My parents had started a college fund for my sister when she was born, something they mentioned frequently and proudly. When I'd asked about college for myself, my father had laughed and told me I was resourceful enough to figure it out. So I had. I'd gone to community college part-time while working full-time, taking classes at night and online when I could. It took me 6 years to get my associate degree, and by then I'd moved into a better-paying job in IT support. Nothing glamorous, but stable, with benefits and room for growth. I'd lived in the cheapest apartments I could find, driven the same old car for nearly a decade, eaten rice and beans more times than I could count. I'd skipped vacations, skipped nights out with friends, skipped everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. My sister, meanwhile, had gone to a private university on my parents' dime. She'd switched majors 4 times, taken 6 years to graduate with a degree in something she never used, and moved back home afterward. She was 24 now and still living in her childhood bedroom, working part-time at a boutique and complaining about how hard adulting was. My parents paid her car insurance, her phone bill, her credit card statements. They'd bought her a new car 2 years ago when hers broke down. They'd funded a trip to Europe last summer so she could find herself. I'd found myself just fine in the aisles of that grocery store at 15, but nobody had seemed concerned about my journey of self-discovery. The lawsuit claimed that my success had caused my sister severe emotional distress. It argued that my refusal to accept family help, my insistence on independence, and my subsequent achievement of homeownership had created an unfair comparison that damaged her self-esteem and future prospects. It stated that I had a responsibility to consider how my actions affected the family unit, and that by deliberately outpacing my sister in life milestones, I'd sabotaged her chances at similar success. I'd sat on my second-hand couch, reading through the legal documents, and I'd started laughing. Not a small chuckle, but deep, gasping laughter that made my ribs hurt. The absurdity of it all hit me like a wave. They were suing me for working hard, for not taking their money, for buying a house with funds I'd earned through a decade of sacrifice. I called a lawyer the next morning. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who listened to my story with an increasingly incredulous expression. She told me the lawsuit was frivolous, that it would likely be dismissed, but that I should take it seriously because family court could be unpredictable. She asked if I had documentation of my financial independence, and I'd shown up to our next meeting with a folder 3 inches thick. Bank statements showing I'd never received deposits from my parents. Pay stubs going back to that first grocery store job. Receipts, records, proof of every dollar I'd earned and spent on my own. She'd smiled at my thoroughness and told me we'd be fine. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 months out, and in that time, the situation escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents started a social media campaign, posting vague messages about ungrateful children and family betrayal. My extended family began choosing sides, with most of them falling in line behind my parents because that's where the family gatherings and holiday invitations came from. I received messages from cousins I barely knew, telling me I should be ashamed, that I should just give my sister the money to make things right. Nobody asked me for my side of the story. Nobody seemed to care that I'd built my life from scratch while my sister had been handed everything and squandered it all. My sister posted a long essay on social media about sibling rivalry and how some people succeed by stepping on others. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she meant. The comments section filled with supportive messages, people telling her she was brave for speaking out, that she deserved better. I didn't respond. I'd learned a long time ago that you can't argue with people who've already decided you're the villain. Work became my refuge. My boss, who'd hired me 5 years earlier when I was still finishing my degree, had watched me climb from help desk support to systems administrator. He'd seen the late nights I'd put in, the extra certifications I'd earned on my own time, the problems I'd solved without being asked. When he noticed I seemed stressed, he'd called me into his office and asked if everything was okay. I'd told him the abbreviated version, and he'd shaken his head in disbelief. He told me that anyone who'd sue their own kid for being successful was insane, and that if I needed any documentation from work for my legal defense, he'd provide it personally. He also told me that a promotion was coming my way, one I'd earned through merit, and that my family's dysfunction shouldn't overshadow that achievement. The promotion came through 2 weeks before the hearing. A significant raise, a better title, more responsibility. I'd celebrated alone in my house, ordering pizza and watching movies until I fell asleep on my couch. It felt simultaneously like the best and loneliest moment of my life. My lawyer had prepped me extensively for the hearing. She'd told me to stay calm, to answer questions directly, to not let my emotions take over no matter what my parents or their lawyer said. She'd warned me that they might try to paint me as cold, as someone who'd rejected family bonds in pursuit of money, as ungrateful for the childhood they'd provided. The hearing itself was surreal. We sat in a small courtroom, my parents on one side with their attorney, me and my lawyer on the other. The judge was an older man with gray hair and an expression that suggested he'd seen everything. My parents' lawyer went first, presenting their case with dramatic flair. He talked about the sacred bonds of family, about how children have obligations to their siblings, about how my deliberate choice to refuse help had created a toxic dynamic. He called my father to the stand, and I watched my dad transform into a grieving parent. He talked about how hard he'd tried to help me, how I'd always been stubborn and difficult, how he'd offered numerous times to assist with college or a car or an apartment, and I'd thrown it back in his face. He said he and my mother had lost sleep worrying about me, that they'd only wanted the best for both their children, that my success had come at the cost of my sister's mental health. It was a masterful performance, and if I hadn't lived through the reality, I might have believed it myself. My mother testified next, crying through most of it. She said she'd always loved both her children equally, that she couldn't understand why I'd shut them out, that watching my sister suffer because of my choices had broken her heart. She claimed they'd set aside money for me too, that it had been there all along waiting for me to accept it, that my pride had destroyed our family. This was news to me. In 26 years, nobody had ever mentioned money set aside in my name. My sister didn't testify, but she sat in the gallery looking appropriately devastated, tissues in hand, playing her part perfectly. Then it was our turn. My lawyer presented the documentation methodically, walking the judge through years of financial records. She showed my employment history, my tax returns, my complete financial independence since adolescence. She presented character statements from former employers, from my college professors, from people who'd watched me work myself to exhaustion while my peers were out enjoying their youth. Then she called me to the stand. I'd been nervous about this part, worried I'd say something wrong or let my anger show through. But once I started talking, it felt almost cathartic. I walked through my history calmly, explaining how I'd started working at 15 because I needed things my parents wouldn't provide. I explained the 2 jobs, the night classes, the years of saving and sacrifice. I explained that I'd never refused help because help had never actually been offered, that the narrative my parents were presenting was a fantasy they'd constructed to justify their unequal treatment. My lawyer asked about the money my mother claimed had been set aside for me. I told the truth, that I'd never heard about it until that moment, that if it existed, nobody had mentioned it in a quarter century. She asked about my relationship with my sister, and I explained that we'd never been close, that she'd been the favorite from birth, and that I'd accepted that reality and moved on with my life. The opposing lawyer cross-examined me, trying to make me seem cold and calculating. He asked why I'd never asked my parents for help, implying that my independence was some kind of spite-driven rebellion. I'd answered honestly that I'd learned early on where I stood in the family hierarchy, and I'd decided to rely on myself rather than beg for scraps of attention and support. He'd asked if I felt superior to my sister. I'd said no, that I felt nothing about my sister one way or another, that we'd lived separate lives and I wished her well, but had no obligation to dim my own light to make her feel better about her choices. The judge had listened to everything with an increasingly skeptical expression, and when the testimonies concluded, he'd asked to see my parents' lawyer in chambers along with my lawyer. They'd been gone for 20 minutes, and when they returned, the opposing counsel looked deflated. The judge had ruled from the bench, something my lawyer later told me was unusual but not unprecedented. He'd called the lawsuit frivolous and bordering on malicious. He'd stated clearly that children have no legal or moral obligation to limit their success for the benefit of siblings, that my financial independence was commendable rather than condemnable, and that my parents' unequal treatment of their children was evident in the record. Then he'd done something I hadn't expected. He'd ordered my parents to pay my legal fees and court costs. He'd lectured them about wasting the court's time with baseless claims and suggested they focus their energy on teaching their daughter independence rather than punishing their son for achieving it. He'd dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile. My parents had sat there in stunned silence. My mother had started crying again, but this time it seemed genuine rather than performative. My father had looked like he'd been slapped, his face red and his jaw working like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I'd walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. My lawyer had congratulated me, told me she'd send the bill for her services to my parents' attorney per the judge's order, and wished me luck with my family situation. But I wasn't done. The judge's ruling had given me an idea, one that grew in my mind over the following days until it became a fully formed plan. They'd tried to financially punish me for succeeding. They'd publicly humiliated me, turned family against me, and painted me as the villain in a story they'd invented. I'd won in court, but I wanted something more. Not revenge exactly, but justice. Accountability. I started documenting everything. I created a detailed timeline of my life, complete with photos, pay stubs, receipts, and records. I showed the grocery store name tag I'd kept from my first job, the acceptance letter from community college, the loan documents from my first car purchase, the lease agreements from every apartment I'd rented, the certificate from every professional course I'd completed, the proof of every milestone I'd reached entirely on my own. Then I documented my sister's journey alongside mine. Her private university acceptance letter that my parents had framed and hung in their hallway. Social media posts about family vacations I'd never been invited to. Photos of her new car with my parents standing proudly beside her. Screenshots of my mother's posts praising my sister's graduation, her European trip, her various achievements that had all been funded by family money. I put it all together in a website, clean and simple, just facts and documentation with minimal commentary. I titled it The Truth About Independence. And I included the court documents showing the dismissed lawsuit and the judge's ruling. Then I shared it. Not publicly, not at first. I sent it privately to every family member who'd sent me hateful messages. To every cousin who'd told me I should be ashamed. To the aunts and uncles who'd sided with my parents without hearing my side. I sent it with a simple message. Since you all felt entitled to judge me based on my parents' lies, I thought you deserved to see the truth. No response necessary. The reactions came quickly. Some people apologized immediately, embarrassed they'd believe the narrative without question. Others doubled down, insisting that family loyalty mattered more than facts. A few admitted they'd always suspected my parents treated us differently, but hadn't wanted to cause problems by speaking up. My mother's sister called me. We'd never been particularly close, but she'd always been kind to me in a distant way. She told me she'd had no idea the extent of what I'd been through, that she'd always assumed I was just the independent type who preferred to do things alone. She said she was ashamed she hadn't looked closer, hadn't questioned why a 15-year-old needed 2 jobs, hadn't wondered why I was never included in family trips or celebrations. She asked if she could share the website more widely, and I told her to do whatever she thought was right. Within days, it had spread through the extended family and into my parents' social circle. The comments on my mother's vague social media posts about ungrateful children suddenly shifted tone. People started asking direct questions. Why had one child needed to work at 15 while the other got everything handed to them? Why sue a child for being successful? What kind of parents do that? My parents tried to control the narrative, posting long explanations about how they'd always offered help that I'd refused, how they'd tried to give me money that I'd rejected out of pride. But it rang hollow against the documentation I'd provided. You can't claim you offered something when there's no record of it ever being mentioned, no text messages, no emails, no bank statements showing attempted transfers. My sister's social media essay about sibling rivalry got new attention too. People started commenting with pointed questions about what exactly she'd overcome, what challenges she'd faced that warranted 6 years of private university funding plus continued financial support into her mid-20s. The sympathetic comments dried up, replaced by criticism and mockery. She deleted the post within a week. My mother stopped posting on social media entirely. My father's account went private. The real satisfaction came about a month after the hearing. I was at a family friend's funeral, one of those community events where attendance felt obligatory despite not being particularly close to the deceased. My parents were there too. We hadn't spoken since the courtroom, and I'd planned to maintain that distance. But during the reception, I'd overheard my mother talking to a group of her friends. She was complaining about me, naturally, telling them how cruel I'd been to air family business publicly, how I'd humiliated them for no reason. One of her friends, a woman I remembered from childhood parties, had cut her off mid-sentence. She'd told my mother that she'd read everything on the website, that she'd found it through a mutual friend, and that she was disgusted by what she'd learned. She said that watching a child work 2 jobs at 15 while you funded your other child's every whim wasn't parenting, it was favoritism. She said that suing that same child for buying a house was beyond disgusting. It was delusional. Then she'd walked away, and the other women in the group had made excuses and dispersed, leaving my mother standing alone looking utterly lost. My father had cornered me by the coffee station later that same day. He'd started to say something about family and forgiveness, but I'd stopped him before he could build up steam. I told him very simply that he'd made his choices, I'd made mine, and we were both living with the consequences. I said I didn't hate him or my mother or my sister, but I also didn't need them in my life. I'd built something good without their help, and I wasn't going to let them tear it down to make themselves feel better about their failures as parents. He'd opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time in my life, I'd seen my father completely without words. I'd walked away and haven't spoken to any of them since. 3 months later, I heard through my aunt that my sister had finally moved out of my parents' house. Apparently, the public scrutiny had motivated her to at least appear independent, though my aunt suspected my parents were still paying most of her bills. She'd gotten a full-time job, though, which was something. My aunt also mentioned that my parents had been asked to step down from a charity board they'd served on for years. Apparently, the other board members felt that people who'd sue their own child for succeeding didn't represent the values the organization wanted to project. My mother had been devastated, my aunt said, but I'd felt nothing hearing it. They'd made choices, and choices have consequences. I'm in my house now, the one I bought with money I earned, writing this all out because sometimes you need to tell your story to process it fully. The mortgage payment comes out of my account every month, proof that I'm building equity and a future entirely on my own terms. I got another promotion at work last month, and I'm being considered for a management position that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. My life is good, and it's good because I made it that way. Without help, without handouts, without anyone to fall back on when things got hard. I learned to rely on myself at 15, and that lesson has served me better than any college fund or family connection ever could have. The lawsuit was meant to punish me, to put me in my place, to force me back into the family dynamic where I was supposed to accept less so my sister could have more. Instead, it freed me completely. It showed me exactly who my parents were, what my sister thought of me, and where I stood with extended family who'd judge without evidence. And the truly hilarious part, the thing that makes me smile every time I think about it, is that they paid for the privilege. My legal fees, the court costs, all of it came out of their pocket per the judge's order. They'd wanted to financially punish me and ended up punishing themselves instead. They'd wanted to publicly humiliate me and ended up exposing their own dysfunction to everyone who mattered to them. I didn't steal my sister's future. I built my own, and if that makes me the villain in their story, I can live with that. I'd rather be the villain in their fiction than a supporting character in their dysfunction. The house is quiet tonight, just me and my thoughts and the satisfaction of knowing I won. Not just in court, but in life. I worked for everything I have, and nobody can take that away from me no matter how hard they try. That's the real victory. Not the judge's ruling, not the public vindication, but the simple fact that I made it. On my own terms, by my own effort, building a life that's entirely mine. They can't sue that away. They can't diminish it or claim credit or pretend they helped when they didn't. I'm 26 years old. I own a house. I have a career with real potential, and I did it all without them. And honestly, that's absolutely hilarious.